Hey guys, Kush here, back with another video. Today I want to talk about filmmaking basics. The first three things you need to know while making a video: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Let's talk about aperture first. Aperture varies from lens to lens. This lens right here is the kit lens. It is a variable aperture lens, so basically at its widest end at 18 it's a 3.5, but when we zoom in all over to 55 it's aperture 5.6, which is pretty close down. The aperture of 3.5 is when it's the most fastest, it's the most open, and when we zoom it all over to 55 the aperture closes down a bit to 5.6, which makes this a variable aperture lens. This is a zoom lens, and another example I want to talk about is a prime lens. The next lens I want to talk about is the Nifty 50. This is usually everyone's second lens. It's a 50mm 1.8. So this lens is super wide. We can open all the way up to 1.8, which creates that crispy shots with the bokeh in the background and everything is blurred out and our subject is super sharp. This lens is fixed at 50mm, unlike this lens, which is a zoom lens that goes from 18 to 55. So these are two different types of lenses. So to understand aperture, it's basically the amount of light your lens is allowing to hit on the sensor. So at 1.8 it's allowing a lot of light to hit, but when we put it down to maybe 4 or 5.6 it allows a lot less light to hit on the sensor. So by either opening up your aperture or closing it, you can either make your image brighter and more focused on a single subject, or you can close it down and decrease the amount of light that's hitting the sensor and have more in focus. So depending on what you want to shoot, what you're shooting, like for example if you're shooting a landscape you could be shooting at f8, f16, but if you're shooting a portrait you'll open it up all the way to 1.8, 2.5 to take a portrait. So depending on the different types of shots you are taking, you will be changing your aperture at that. Next I want to talk about shutter speed. The main dependent on what your shutter speed is going to be is what frame you're shooting at. There are basically three frame weights that most cameras come with: 24, 30 and 60. 24 is the most frequently used frame rates out of all of them. So when we're like this shot right here, it's in 24 frames per second. If I'm shooting an interview or documentary, mostly I'm going to shoot that at 24 frames per second as well. But if we want to slow down a shot, we could shoot it at 60 frames per second. We could slow it down by 45% to create a bit of a slow-mo. Shutter speed is dependent on frame rate. So the basic rule of shutter speed is you want it to be double your frame rate. If we're shooting at 24 frames per second, double of that would be 48. But we don't have 1/48th of a second on our DSLR cameras. So the closest to that is 1/50th of a second. We want to keep our frame rate at 1/50th of a second when we're shooting at 24 frames per second. The reason for this is so we can have a natural motion blur. Like when I'm moving my hand like this, you can see that there is a bit of a motion blur. So if I would be shooting at a faster shutter speed, for example 1/250th of a second, so then this motion blur will be much less. But if I increase my shutter speed to 1/30th of a second, there would be much more motion blur and it would not feel natural at all. So 1/50th of a second is what you would want to keep as your shutter speed when you're shooting in 24 frames per second. On the other hand, when you're shooting at 60 frames per second, double of that would be 1/20th of a second. So in that you'll want our frame rates to be 1/120th of a second. But our DSLRs, as I said, our DSLRs don't have 1/120th of a second. The closest to that is 1/25th of a second. So when you're shooting at 60 frames per second, that's what you'd want your shutter speed to be. So basically if you're shooting at 24, you'll keep your shutter speed at 50, and if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you'll keep your shutter speed 1/20th. Basically it's going to be double of what you shoot. When you slow down your 60 frames per second clip at the shutter speed of 1/25th, the motion blur produced will still feel natural. But now there's times when you want to increase your shutter speed. For example, if you're at a scene and you're at your lowest ISO of 100, we'll cover ISO later, and you're at your lowest ISO of 100, and if you want to keep your subject in focus and you're going to be shooting at for example you're going to be shooting at f2.8 and you're at 24 frames per second, so your shutter speed is at 50th. But now you're looking, everything is blown out in the shot, it's fully white, nothing is comprehensible, it's overexposed. So what you're going to do is you're going to increase your shutter speed to 1/120th, 1/250th, 1/500th until you find that your shot is properly exposed. This would be the only reason you need to increase your shutter speed other than keeping it normal. But if you want to keep your shutter speed at 1/50th of a second, you'd need to use a neutral density filter. What's that is, it's like the easiest way to explain it is like sunglasses for your camera. So it will limit the amount of light that would be entering it through a dark piece of glass that you put on front of the lens. But instead of buying that, you could just increase your shutter speed a bit. Then since those are a little expensive, it's better to just increase your shutter speed, and maybe later on you could buy one if you think it's worth it for you. Next, let's talk ISO. Our main goal with ISO is to keep it as low as possible, since ISO is like artificial light. As we increase ISO, the sensitivity of light on this camera sensor increases, which in turn creates noise. To explain noise more easily, I'll take an example. If I whisper into a microphone, and then to make that voice more audible, I increase the decibels of the audio, you will hear my voice more clearly. But the ambient sound around me, the soft noises of maybe the traffic going on behind me or someone talking in the background there, it will be more audible as well, since the other soft sounds, the soft sounds that would get washed out if I would have talked louder, wouldn't be audible. So basically we could understand ISO in that way as well. So ISO is similar to that. If we increase our ISO, that starts from 100 and usually goes up to 6400, 128,000. So if we put it up to 1600, and the camera will be much more sensitive to light. Even small dots of light will be visible on the sensor and we'll be able to see it, in turn creating a softer image that's grainy as well. So these three things, aperture, shutter speed and ISO, create an exposure triangle. I think if you practice enough, you will understand the basics and it will become really simple, since these are the three basic rules for filmmaking. So get out there, take a bunch of shots, keep on practicing, and I'll see you in the next video.